Welcome back to Child Mental Health for Pediatric Clinicians, the podcast formerly known as Psyched for Peds. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Fallucco, child psychiatrist and mom. Today, I'm really excited to talk about all of the things you should know about ADHD in girls. First, we're going to talk about why this is important. And second, we'll talk about how girls with ADHD look differently than boys with ADHD, and also why that makes it so hard to be able to detect them. Then we'll talk about which kids you should worry about in your practice who might have undiagnosed ADHD. And finally, I'm going to share a little bit about ADHD superpowers. So let's get started. First, let's talk about why you should care about ADHD in girls. As you may already know, ADHD is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder affecting youth. About 1 in 9 kids ages 3 to 17 have ADHD. And the prevalence of ADHD has been rising over the past decade, which you could probably tell from your own practice. And at one point in time, really decades ago, ADHD was thought to be a disorder almost exclusively affecting boys, with 25 times as many boys diagnosed with ADHD as girls. And over time, this gender ratio has significantly narrowed to the point that now we think it's about twice as many boys have ADHD as girls. And then when you get into adulthood, this ratio narrows even further, where you see that there are almost as many women with diagnoses of ADHD as there are men. So it makes you wonder, what is going on here with this change in the ratio of males to females with ADHD over time? Is it A, boys are really that much more likely to have ADHD than girls? B, girls just present with symptoms of ADHD later in life? C, we're just really not good at detecting symptoms of ADHD in girls compared to boys, and that's why we don't see as many girls with ADHD in childhood? Or is it D, all of the above? And just as a side note, the studies I'm going to refer to in this episode talk about boys and girls from a biological sex perspective. So lots of questions, but the bottom line is that as far as what we know now, girls are much less likely to be diagnosed than boys with ADHD, even at the same levels of impairment. And oftentimes, girls who have ADHD symptoms are under-recognized. And even when girls are diagnosed, these diagnoses are made often much later in their lives compared to boys. On top of that, even when girls are diagnosed with ADHD, they're less likely to be prescribed medication than boys, even when you control for symptom severity. So that means even when a given girl and a boy both have symptoms that are causing the same amount of impact and problem on their functioning at school or at home or with friends, girls are less likely to be given treatment. But treatment is so important for so many reasons. Treatment with ADHD meds can be highly effective, helping kids with ADHD do their best, perform at their highest level at school, or ultimately in work as they age. But the biggest, most important thing that I hope you'll remember as a take-home from this is that treatment for ADHD reduces the risk of some of the leading causes of death in teens, which include suicide, drug abuse, accidents, and injuries related to accidents. So this is really why you should care, because so many girls with ADHD are going without a diagnosis or are not being treated. And that in turn increases their risk for all of these bad outcomes. So the bottom line is it's really important to be able to recognize all kids with ADHD, but particularly girls who tend to be underdiagnosed and underrecognized. And when you recognize those symptoms, it is really important to have discussions about treatment. We've talked about why it's important to recognize ADHD in girls, and now we're going to talk about how to do that. So what does ADHD look like in girls, and why are girls with ADHD so challenging to detect and so easy to miss? So the first thing that we need to know about girls with ADHD is they're more likely to present with the subtle inattentive symptoms, as opposed to the boys who are more likely to present with the hyperactive impulsive symptoms or the combined hyperactive impulsive plus inattentive symptoms. So think about it this way. The stereotypical girl with ADHD is much more likely to show inattentive symptoms and less likely to have the obvious hyperactivity and impulsivity. These girls may have trouble staying focused when they're asked to listen to long lectures in class, or they're asked to read a long passage, or even when they're engaged in a longer conversation with their friends or family. Girls with ADHD with this inattentive subtype often start projects or start tasks, but then they easily lose focus and they're quickly sidetracked and want to do something else that's a little bit more interesting or exciting. Sometimes these girls with the inattentive subtype don't seem to be paying attention when you're talking to them, and you often have to repeat yourself to get a response from them. So they sometimes seem to be a little spaced out. So that's the stereotypical form of predominantly inattentive subtype. And you can see when you've got these subtle symptoms, you're much less likely to draw attention from teachers or parents, because these are things that the girls are experiencing in their head, in their minds, and it's really hard to tell that from the outside. Whereas the boys with ADHD are more likely to present with the mainly hyperactive, impulsive subtype or the combined subtype. They're very hyper. They're climbing on the furniture in the office. They're spinning around on your chair. They're physically busy, even more so than you would expect for a neurotypical boy of the same age or the same developmental level. So the second thing to know about girls with ADHD is girls express their hyperactivity or express their impulsivity in a way that's different compared to boys. So boys with ADHD are more likely to have very physical hyperactivity and impulsivity. For example, boys are more likely to have trouble sitting still, to often leave their seat in the classroom. They're more likely to be fidgeting with their hands or feet, or to run around or climb excessively, which is one of the criteria for ADHD, climb excessively. So in other words, boys with ADHD really like to move their body. They're showing physical impulsivity, manifesting it through their body, which again makes it easier for us to detect from the outside. Whereas girls with ADHD express their hyperactivity and impulsivity in more of a verbal way than in a physical way. So girls are more likely to be called the chatty Cathys. They talk excessively. They're more likely to interrupt. And even when you've got girls and boys with the same level of hyperactivity and impulsivity, the girls are more likely to endorse these verbal symptoms, whereas the boys are more likely to show physical hyperactivity and impulsivity. And let's say even if girls are interrupting in class or maybe are talking a lot in class, that's certainly less disruptive than having a stereotypical boy who is popping out of his seat or hitting another child or running around the classroom or climbing excessively. That's my favorite symptom. It helps us understand why girls are less likely to be recognized than boys, because some of their symptoms are less disruptive to a classroom setting, to a family, etc., than girls' symptoms are. So now that we've talked about the differences between boys and girls with ADHD, now let's talk about which kids you should worry about who may have unrecognized ADHD. So we'll start with the more straightforward things. First, you want to look out for obvious academic problems in school, where their grades are slipping, or they're spending an inordinate amount of time on schoolwork, or the opposite, they're totally avoiding it or rushing through it. And then, of course, you want to look out for social problems, because kids with ADHD who tend to be more impulsive may show this when they're having conversations with their friends by interrupting or blurting things out, or even may exhibit these symptoms in class, and then they'll be flagged as unusual. There's also a particular developmental stage where we tend to see a second wave of kids with ADHD in our office, and that would be the transition to middle school. Now, developmentally, this is a time where the academic load massively increases compared to elementary school, and also the social demands are much higher. And so kids who maybe have been able to skirt along through elementary school just fine begin to have problems in middle school with their grades dropping or having more obvious social impairment. As developmentally at this time, girls tend to connect with one another verbally and through conversation. So if you're a girl with a lot of ADHD related impulsivity and you're interrupting conversations or talking nonstop or blurting out answers, you may have trouble seamlessly connecting with other girls. So we've talked about some signs that somebody could be struggling with ADHD. And those are namely having academic problems, having social problems, or somebody who's struggling through the transition from elementary school to middle school. Now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about genetic risk factors and other clinical factors that could indicate somebody may be at high risk for ADHD. The first types of kids who are high risk are kids whose parent has ADHD. We know that ADHD runs in families. It's highly heritable, so it's passed down from parents to kids, just like hair color and eye color and some other traits. So when I make a new diagnosis of ADHD, I often ask the family, which parent does the child seem to take after in this respect? And almost always, universally, one parent will either name themselves or their partner and say, oh my gosh, my child is just like their father or their mother. So we look out for kids if we have a known diagnosis of a parent with ADHD. So this would be great and really helpful, except for the fact that there are a ton of parents running around who also have undiagnosed ADHD. And so we can't always rely on the parents having gone through the process of being diagnosed and treated and being able to recognize symptoms in themselves and therefore be able to see and recognize the symptoms in their child. So the other type of kids we want to look out for are kids whose siblings have ADHD. Again, because it's highly genetic and highly heritable, just having a sibling with ADHD increases your risk. And in fact, one large study published in JAMA Peds found that kids whose sibling had ADHD were 13 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than kids who didn't have a sibling with ADHD. And in this same study, they estimated that if a child has a sibling with ADHD, they have about a 1 in 2 or a 1 in 4 chance of being diagnosed with ADHD themselves. So the bottom line is we need to look out for siblings of kids who already have ADHD. And since we know that boys are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, I would say if you have a child in your office whose brother has ADHD, you need to be thinking about ADHD in them. Okay, third potential clue that this child's at higher risk for ADHD would be a child that already has a diagnosis of anxiety or some type of learning difference or even a mood disorder, because we know that kids with ADHD are at high risk of having comorbid anxiety, mood disorders, learning challenges, and also substance use later in life. And there's this concept with a really beautiful name called diagnostic overshadowing, which basically means that when somebody has more than one mental health diagnosis, oftentimes one of the diagnoses is more obvious to us as clinicians. And so we're more likely to diagnose them with that and then potentially miss this other diagnosis that they may have. So something to think about. And then finally, another clue that you may be working with a kid who has undiagnosed ADHD would be the presence of ADHD superpowers. And I want to let you know before I tell you about these superpowers that a lot of this is based on clinical and anecdotal evidence, but we don't have a ton of systematic studies that are looking at this. So just as a disclaimer. But some of the ADHD superpowers are the ability to hyperfocus. So these would be kids who can pay attention to some task or activity, whatever it is that's really interesting to them. Maybe it's Minecraft, maybe it's video games, or maybe it's even a sport that they're really, really interested in. And they can pay attention for a really long period of time and be incredibly successful in this area. And unfortunately, this superpower that we see in a lot of kids with ADHD, this ability to hyperfocus, is one of the parts that makes it really hard to diagnose them. Because as a parent, or even as a clinician, you see, oh, well, look, they can pay attention to this for a really long period of time. And so they can't have problems with their attention and concentration. But again, their ability to hyperfocus is based on their high motivation. So for all of us, when we're motivated or really excited about something, we can zoom in or super focus because our motivation is kind of helping us. The difference is that in neurodivergent kids who have ADHD, when they don't have that motivation, when something's not as interesting, that's when you see the differences and where it's much more difficult for them to sustain attention because it's boring and they like things that are very exciting. And how can you blame them? The other superpower with ADHD you sometimes see is high degrees of creativity or artistic ability. Neurodivergent people with ADHD have incredible ways of solving problems, at looking at the world, at being able to build and create things, and have incredible imaginations because they're not necessarily constrained to linear step-by-step processes in their thinking. Another superpower with ADHD is high amounts of energy. It takes a lot for them to be worn out, and often they have trouble falling asleep because they are just so busy and they want to be on the go. Again, this is kind of an amazing superpower, but sometimes makes it hard when you're the parent of a child with lots of energy. So to recap, we've talked about why it is so critically important to recognize kids with ADHD, particularly those with the inattentive subtype, and to get them treatment promptly to decrease the risk of negative outcomes and help them to be their best at school and in life. We've also talked about how boys and girls differ in terms of their ADHD, with girls presenting with more inattentive symptoms and girls also presenting with more verbal impulsivity as opposed to boys who present with more physical impulsivity as well as hyperactivity. We've talked about which kids you should worry about, and briefly to recap, those with academic problems, social challenges, or kids with recognized learning differences, anxiety, or mood disorder. Also be on the lookout for those kids with a first-degree relative with ADHD, usually a parent or a sibling. And of course, we want to have our eyes wide open for all of our patients during the transition to middle school, because this is often when we begin to see a second wave of unrecognized ADHD. And finally, have a high degree of suspicion among kids with some of the ADHD superpowers, like the ability to hyperfocus, high amounts of energy, and lots of creativity. Thank you so much for taking this time to listen. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or any ideas or mystery cases of your own, please feel free to reach out to me at Instagram at psyched4peds or on our website at psyched4peds.com. Thanks so much. See you next time.